Hunting season had always been a tradition for me. Every November, like clockwork, I'd rent a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota and spend a week immersed in the solitude of nature. The isolation, the crisp air, the quiet rustling of leaves. All of it felt like a reset button on life. I wasn't the best hunter, but that didn't matter. I wasn't there for the trophies. I was there for the escape. Last year, though, something changed. What happened during that trip still haunts me. I'd rented a cozy, single-room cabin at the edge of a state forest, a perfect spot. The owner had told me the area was well known for deer and elk, but also warned that the property bordered private land where hunting was prohibited. Stay within the marked boundaries, he'd said, and if you run into anyone, let me know. The drive out was uneventful, though by the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The road to the cabin was a narrow, winding stretch of dirt surrounded by towering pines. When I finally pulled up, the headlights illuminated a small wooden cabin with a steep roof and a single porch light glowing faintly in the growing darkness. It was picturesque but eerily quiet. I unloaded my gear, found the key under the mat as promised, and settled in. The cabin was simple but comfortable, just a bed, a kitchenette, and a small fireplace. After unpacking, I set an alarm for 5:30 a.m. and crawled into bed, eager to start the hunt at dawn. The morning was freezing, my breath visible in the pale gray light as I hiked into the woods. I followed the owner's map, which marked the property lines with thick red ink. After about an hour, I found a good spot near a fallen tree, set up my gear, and settled in to wait. The forest was alive with sound. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the faint chatter of birds, but nothing stirred within range of my rifle. I was about to move when a voice cut through the stillness. "What the hell are you doing here?" My heart jumped into my throat. I spun around to see a man standing about 20 yards away, partially obscured by the trees. He looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair and a lean build. He was wearing a camouflage jacket and holding a rifle, the barrel resting casually against his shoulder. "Hunting," I stammered. "This is public land, isn't it?" The man shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "Not here, it's not. You're on private property." I frowned, pulling out the map the owner had given me. "I don't think so," the cabin owner said. "I don't care what he said," the man interrupted, stepping closer. "This is private land, and you need to leave." His tone was cold, almost menacing. I nodded, apologizing as I packed up my gear. As I turned to leave, I felt his eyes on me, watching my every move. When I glanced back, he was gone. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the encounter. Something about the man had unnerved me. His sudden appearance, the way he spoke, the way he disappeared so quickly. I decided to try another spot that afternoon, this time on the far side of the property. The second hunt was no better than the first. By sunset, I hadn't seen a single deer, and I trudged back to the cabin feeling defeated. When I got there, I noticed something strange. The door was ajar. I was certain I'd locked it before leaving. Cautiously, I stepped inside. The room looked untouched, but a strange tension hung in the air. My bag, which I'd left zipped up, was now open, its contents spilling onto the bed. The food I'd left on the counter was slightly rearranged, as if someone had been in a hurry. My stomach churned as I checked the rest of the cabin. Every corner, every closet, every shadow, but no one was there. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder, every rustle of the wind outside sharper. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps on the porch. My breath hitched as I lay perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped, followed by the faint creak of the door. Gripping the rifle I'd kept by my bed, I swung my legs over the side and crept toward the door. My heart pounded as I threw it open, aiming into the darkness. No one was there. The next morning, I decided to cut the trip short. I packed my gear and loaded up the truck, eager to get out of the woods. But as I drove down the narrow dirt road, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the trees was the man from the day before. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and he was smiling. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a twisted, knowing grin that made my skin crawl. He raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave as I passed. When I returned the cabin key, I told the owner what had happened. His expression turned grim, and he asked me to describe the man. When I did, he shook his head. "No one lives up there," he said. "Hasn't been anyone on that land in years." "What about the private property?" I asked. "There's no private property near the cabin," he replied. "That whole area is state-owned." To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered in those woods, but every time I think about his smile, I feel the same cold dread I felt that night. And every time I hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, I wonder if he's still out there, watching. Hunting had always been my way of decompressing. There's something about being out in the wild, away from the constant noise of the world, that feels deeply grounding. So when my old friend Trevor invited me to join him for a weekend trip to a hunting lodge deep in the Appalachian Mountains, I jumped at the chance. The lodge wasn't fancy. A two-room cabin perched on a ridge with a view that stretched for miles. Trevor's family had owned it for decades, and he'd spent countless weekends there as a kid. "It's remote," he warned me as we drove up the winding mountain road, the dense forest swallowing us whole. "No cell service, no electricity, just you, me, and the woods." I didn't mind. The isolation was part of the appeal, but I had no idea just how isolated we'd feel, or how terrifying that isolation would become. The first day was perfect. We arrived mid-morning, unloaded our gear, and spent the afternoon scouting the area. The forest was dense, but the trails were well-worn, marked by years of Trevor's family coming and going. We spotted a few deer tracks and even heard the faint call of an elk somewhere in the distance. As the sun began to set, we made our way back to the cabin. Trevor built a fire while I cooked dinner, the crackle of flames and the hum of crickets filling the quiet night. It felt peaceful, serene. That peace didn't last. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of movement outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But as I lay there, listening, the noises became more deliberate. Heavy, measured footsteps circled the cabin, crunching through the fallen leaves. "Trevor," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Someone's outside." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just an animal," he mumbled, rolling over. "Animals don't walk like that," I said, my voice low but urgent. Trevor sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt suffocating. He grabbed his flashlight and rifle, motioning for me to stay put as he crept toward the door. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice firm. "This is private property." No answer. He shined the flashlight through the window, sweeping the beam across the yard. For a moment, everything was still. Then, at the edge of the light, something moved, just a flicker of motion before disappearing into the shadows. The next morning, we found tracks around the cabin. They were human, but barefoot, the toes and heels clearly visible in the soft dirt. The prints led from the tree-line to the cabin, circling it multiple times before disappearing back into the woods. "This is messed up," Trevor muttered, crouching to examine one of the prints. "No one should be up here. Maybe it's some kind of squatter?" I suggested, though the words felt hollow. The tracks were too precise, too deliberate, and the idea of someone wandering the woods barefoot in the middle of the night sent a chill down my spine. Trevor shook his head. "We'd have seen signs of a camp. This is something else." We decided to stay close to the cabin that day, keeping our rifles within arm's reach at all times. The forest felt different, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves replaced by an eerie stillness. Every snap of a twig made me jump, my eyes darting to the shadows, searching for movement. By sunset, we were on edge. The tracks had put us both on high alert, and we decided to keep watch in shifts through the night. Trevor volunteered to take the first watch, while I tried to get some sleep. I woke to the sound of the door creaking open. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up, my eyes darting around the cabin. Trevor was gone. The chair he'd been sitting in was empty, his rifle leaning against the wall. "Trevor?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I grabbed my own rifle and crept toward the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The night was pitch black, the fire reduced to faintly glowing embers. The door swung slightly in the breeze, and I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. "Trevor!" I called again, louder this time. The forest swallowed my voice. I followed the faint beam of my flashlight, scanning the yard for any sign of him. That's when I saw the tracks. They led away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. But something about them was wrong. They were spaced too far apart, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had been running. And next to Trevor's boot prints were more of the barefoot tracks, overlapping his in a chaotic pattern. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I couldn't leave Trevor out there. The trail led me deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around me. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. My flashlight flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced across the trees. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by a rustling in the underbrush. I froze, my finger tightening on the trigger of my rifle. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could hear the heavy breathing of something just beyond the edge of the light. "Trevor?" I called, my voice trembling. A figure stepped into the beam of my flashlight. It wasn't Trevor. The thing standing before me was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glinted in the light, dark and hollow, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that sent a wave of cold terror through me. It took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, and I raised my rifle, firing blindly. The shot echoed through the forest, but the thing didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching me with that awful smile. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. I found Trevor about 100 yards from the cabin, slumped against a tree and unconscious. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. I dragged him back to the cabin, barricaded the door, and sat with my rifle in hand until dawn. We left the next morning, abandoning most of our gear in our rush to get out. Trevor couldn't remember what had happened, just a vague feeling of being followed and then nothing. But when I told him what I'd seen, he went quiet, his face ashen. We haven't been back to the cabin since, and every time I step into the woods, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble into its territory. Growing up in Montana, hunting was more than a pastime. It was a way of life. My father taught me the skills when I was a teenager, and I've carried the tradition on ever since. There's a particular stretch of national forest land about 30 miles outside Billings that I've always loved. It's dense with elk and deer, remote enough to escape the noise of the world, and usually free of other hunters. But last year, during one of my annual hunting trips, I learned there are some places even the most experienced outdoorsmen should avoid. I'd set out early that morning, hoping to catch a trail before sunrise. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. It was the kind of stillness I loved, peaceful, undisturbed. I followed a game trail for about 2 hours before setting up near a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. It was the perfect spot, quiet, secluded, and with clear sight lines. As the hours passed, the forest seemed unusually still. No birds, no squirrels, no sign of the elk I was tracking. It was as if the woods had gone silent, holding their breath. That's when I heard the first whistle. At first, I thought it was a bird, a short, shrill note that echoed through the trees. But then it came again, clearer this time. It wasn't a bird. It was human. I froze, scanning the forest for movement. The whistle repeated, 3 short bursts, followed by a pause. It sounded close, but I couldn't see anyone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the heavy silence. "Anyone out there?" No response. I waited, listening, but the forest remained silent. After a few minutes, I shook it off, telling myself it was just another hunter, or maybe someone hiking. But something about it didn't sit right. The sound had been too deliberate, too precise. As the day wore on, I decided to move deeper into the woods. I followed the game trail until I came to a second clearing, this one larger than the first. The air here felt heavier, colder, as if the sun hadn't touched this part of the forest in years. I scanned the area, my rifle at the ready, but there was no movement, no animals, no rustling leaves. Nothing. Then the whistling started again. This time, it was louder, coming from somewhere behind me. 3 sharp bursts, followed by silence. I spun around, my heart racing, but the woods were empty. "Who's there?" I shouted, gripping my rifle tightly. No answer. For the next hour, the whistling followed me. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, first to my left, then to my right, then directly ahead. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just some idiot playing games. But deep down, I knew better. By late afternoon, I decided to head back to my truck. The trail felt longer than I remembered, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. The whistling continued, growing closer, until it sounded like it was right behind me. I turned suddenly, raising my rifle, but no one was there. That's when I saw it. Standing about 30 yards away, just beyond the edge of the clearing, was a man. At least, I think it was a man. He was tall and thin, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. He wore tattered clothing, and his face was partially obscured by shadows. But what struck me most were his eyes, or rather, the lack of them. The sockets were dark and empty, and yet I felt them watching me. He raised a hand and waved, a slow, deliberate motion that made my blood run cold. Then he whistled. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and ran, the sound of my boots crunching on the leaves drowned out by the rapid pounding of my heart. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending, the path ahead vanishing into darkness. The whistling followed me, growing louder and more erratic. It wasn't just 3 bursts anymore. It was a chaotic, shrill melody that echoed through the woods, piercing and unnatural. No matter how fast I ran, it seemed to be right behind me. When I finally reached the truck, I jumped inside, locking the doors and starting the engine in one frantic motion. My hands trembled as I threw it into gear and tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. As I sped down the narrow forest road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the middle of the road, his head tilted, his hand raised in that slow, mocking wave. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I parked at a gas station and sat there for what felt like hours, trying to catch my breath. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? But I knew I couldn't go back to those woods. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the sound of that whistle. I'd hear it in my dreams, sharp and distant, as if calling me back. Even now, when I'm out hunting in other areas, I sometimes catch myself listening for it, half expecting to see him standing at the edge of the trees, waiting,